Shalom. So today I want to talk about the Exodus. Not just the Exodus, but what can we see in history from the Exodus? So for the last few weeks I've been studying this book by Immanuel Velikovsky. I've read this book several times in the last couple of weeks. It's a fascinating study into ancient history. And Mr. Velikovsky, when his books were first published, he was ridiculed and ostracized because his theories and his understanding went against the grain of what the accepted, more mainstream kind of historians believed. And there was just this whole campaign of smear tactics where the academia was trying to discredit Mr. Velikovsky. Now, unusually enough, since then, he published his books back in the 1950s and 60s, but since then, his theories, a lot of them have actually been proven to be true. And recently there was a movie made. The name of the movie was Patterns of Evidence, and it was about the Exodus. And so in this movie, Patterns of Evidence, they're proposing a lot of the same things that Mr. Velikovsky did about the timeline of ancient Egypt. They arrived at it in some ways, from a different direction, but this groundbreaking movie actually coincides very closely with what Mr. Velikovsky was saying 60 or 70 years ago. So, historians disagree as to the date of the Exodus, and many hypotheses have been proposed, but for more than 2,000 years they have agreed that the Exodus took place during the period called, in present terminology, the New Kingdom of Egypt. So, if you don't know, Egyptian history is divided into three primary ages. There was the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom would have been when the pyramids were built. And then that fell into a time of chaos. And during this time of chaos, we don't have a whole lot of information, but eventually this Middle Kingdom rose to power. The Middle Kingdom was kind of like a Renaissance type period. It was when Egypt reached the height of literature and art, and it was kind of a golden age in Egypt. Then, through a series of disasters, the land again fell into a time of chaos. It was invaded by a group of people known as the Hyksos, who ruled for about 500 years, and this created a type of dark age of Egypt. And afterwards, when the Hyksos were finally expelled from Egypt, then you had the New Kingdom come in. And the New Kingdom is generally when most historians think the Israelites came in. This is when Jacob and his sons moved into Israel, and when Joseph was the viceroy of Egypt, and eventually during the time of Ramesses is when the Exodus occurred. That's what traditional historians believe. However, some historians raise the question about, well, why is there not an actual record of this? Why don't we see this reflected in the Egyptian records of the New Kingdom, the plagues, and the escape of the Israelites? Because the biblical story does not present the departure from Egypt as an everyday occurrence, but rather an event accompanied by violent upheavals of nature. Grave and ominous signs preceded the Exodus. Clouds of dust and smoke darkened the sky. The dust tore wounds in the skin of men and beasts. Vermin and reptiles bred and filled the air and earth. Wild beasts, a terrible torrent of hailstones fell, and a wildfire ran upon the ground. Swarms of locusts, blasts of cinders, day and night, night and day. And the gloom grew to a prolonged night, and blackness extinguished every ray of light. Then came the 10th and most mysterious plague. The angel of Yeshua passed over the houses of the children of Israel. The next day the Israelite slaves were released from Egypt and began the long journey to the Promised Land. But almost immediately they were pursued by the army of the king, who regretted their escape. They were trapped between mountains and sea. The night was frightful. A heavy cloud darkened the sky, which was rent by incessant lightning. A hurricane raged the whole night, and at dawn the sea was cleft. The waters torn by a double tide of gigantic force. The slaves passed through, the pursuers followed in chariots, but the waters returned, and the Egyptians with their king, fleeing against them, met their death in the waves. Now, if you watched many movies about the Exodus, you're probably like, wait a minute. I don't recall there being hurricane winds or earthquakes or any of that kind of stuff. Well, the thing is that when you see the Exodus portrayed, it's generally in terms of fair weather, blue skies. The children of Israel are walking out of Egypt. Everybody's laughing and cheering, and the children are running around playing and such. But the source of information for the Exodus is not only in the book of Exodus. It's referred to several times in the Psalms and in the prophetic books. And so it's mentioned several times in Scripture. And one thing it's always mentioned with is upheavals. Mountains melting, shaking off their foundations. The hurricane. Now, Mr. Velikovsky went in and did a lot of research in this subject from the peoples around Egypt, not just the Egyptians. Like he's got sources from Greek and Arabia and all over that region that testify about these same events occurring to them. Like this was a huge phenomenon, maybe even global. So the hurricane force winds is something that's always mentioned in these accounts. There was a tremendous hurricane. And Mr. Velikovsky in his book, Worlds in Collision, goes into a lot of detail to really prove that out. Now, it's outside the scope of this study, but I can show you from the Scriptures some of the things that the other scriptural accounts have about the Exodus. And I think if you look at this and you really think about it, you'll understand. Have you ever thought about in the book of the Exodus that the children of Israel act like they're terrified of everything? I mean, how many times are the people crying out about, wishing that they were dead and such and so forth? Personally, I think what they had was post-traumatic stress disorder. They had went through a tremendous upheaval in the whole natural system. If you can imagine the worst storm that you've ever lived in, whether it's like a hurricane or a tornado, the type of storm that most people would be huddled into like a closet in their home or something, trying to ride it out. If you can remember, instead of doing that, if you can imagine having to pack up all your belongings and flee from the city in the middle of that type of weather, and then add in with that, couple that with thunderbolts smashing the land around you, or the tremendous earthquake going on at the same time and buildings collapsing, that's the kind of thing that these people went out of the Exodus experiencing. So, for instance, Psalm 18, the earth shook and trembled, the foundations of hills moved and were shaken, smoke and fire, coals were kindled, the channels of water were seen, and the fountains of the world were discovered. Psalm 97, his lightnings enlightened the world, the earth saw and trembled, the hills melted like wax. He removeth the mountains, he overturneth them in his anger, he shaketh the earth out of her place. This doesn't sound like the scene that you're given in the Ten Commandments movie. The earth trembled, the mountains melted, even Sinai. I call to remembrance my song in the night. Will Yahuwah cast off forever? Hath Elohim forgotten to be gracious? I will remember thy wonders of old. The depths also were troubled. The lightnings lightened the world. The earth trembled and shook. Thou leddest thy people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Psalm 77. Go to Psalm 60. Thou hast made the earth to tremble. Thou hast broken it. Heal the breaches thereof, for it shaketh. Thou hast showed thy people hard things. Thou hast made us to drink the wine of astonishment. Okay, so now seeing that the Exodus event was this tremendous cataclysm, the logical question to be asked is this testimony entirely false? Why is there no record of the Exodus in the Egyptian records? Can it be that nothing of this was noticed by the Egyptians? In 1909, Alan H. Garnier published a translated Egyptian text under the title The Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage from a Hieratic Papyrus in Leiden. Garnier argued that all the internal evidence of the text points to the historical character of the situation. Egypt was in distress. The social system had become disorganized. Violence filled the land. Invaders preyed upon the defenseless population. The rich were stripped of everything and slept in the open, and the poor took their possessions. It is no merely logical disturbance here that is described, but a great and overwhelming natural disaster. Garnier interprets the text as though the words of a sage named Ippawar were directed to some king, blaming him for inactivity which has brought confusion, insecurity, and suffering to the people. The Almighty, to whom Ippawar directs his words, is a customary appellation of great gods. Because the introductory passages of the papyrus, where the author and his listeners would likely to be mentioned, are missing, the presence of the king listening to the sage is assumed on the basis of the preferred form of certain other literary examples of the Middle Kingdom. So the internal evidence in this document places it in the time of the Middle Kingdom. Now we're told that the Exodus occurred in the New Kingdom, 600 years later. However, this papyrus describing the event describes the Exodus in the Middle Kingdom, not the New Kingdom. So the papyrus is a script of lamentations, a description of ruin and horror. And it says, "Forsooth, the land turns round as does a potter's wheel. The towns are destroyed. Upper Egypt has become a dry waste. All is in ruin. The residence is overturned in a minute. Years of noise. There's no end to noise. Oh, that the earth would cease from noise, and tumult or uproar be no more." So what do noise and years of noise denote? The translator wrote, "There is clearly some play upon the word noise here, the point of which is to us obscure. Does it mean earthquake and years of earthquake? In Hebrew, the word ra'ash signifies noise, commotion, as well as earthquake. Earthquakes are often accompanied by loud sounds, subterranean rumblings and roarings, and the acoustic phenomena gives the name to the upheaval itself. Apparently, the shaking returned again and again, and the country was reduced to ruins. The state went into sudden decline, and life became unbearable. The papyrus of Ippawar contains evidence of some natural cataclysm accompanied by earthquakes and bears witness to the appearance of things as they happened at that time. When we compare the passages from the book of Exodus and from the papyrus, we begin to notice certain similarities. The papyrus says, "Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere." Exodus 7:21, there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. Papyrus, "The river is blood." Exodus, all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. Papyrus, men shrank from tasting human beings and thirst after water. Exodus, and the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the river. Exodus, the river stank. Papyrus, that is our water, this is our happiness, what shall we do in respect thereof? All is ruin. Exodus, and the hail smote every herb of the field and brake every tree of the field. Papyrus, trees are destroyed, no fruit nor herbs are found. A great part of the people lost their lives in one violent shock. Houses were struck with a furious blow. Exodus 12:27, the angel of Yeshua passed over the houses of the children of Israel, and when he smote the Egyptians, and delivered our houses. The word nogah for smote is used for a violent blow, i.e. for thrusting with the horns of an ox. Now, we should probably take a break and let me explain something. One of the theories that Velikovsky puts forth is when it says that the firstborn of Egypt was killed, he says, he mentioned, this is this would be impossible to explain by natural means. I mean, how could you have a plague or have an event that would only kill the firstborn? Now, I know if you're a generally religious person, you'll say, well, it was a miracle. It was Yahuwah's hand that went through and did this. But what if there's, the rest of the plagues, they were all brought about by natural means. supernaturally inflicted, possibly or probably, but a lot of this stuff could be attributed to natural phenomena. Now, so Mr. Velikovsky makes the point that the word in Hebrew for chosen and firstborn are very similar. So where it says Israel my chosen is Israel Bechiri or Bechori with a het. But Israel my firstborn is Israel Bechori with a kaf. It's almost the exact same pronunciation. In fact, because I'm not a native Hebrew speaker, I can't speak it in a way to differentiate. Like both ways that I say it, Bechori, Bechori, I mean, it sounds the same. I'm not phonetically comfortable enough with the Hebrew language to be able to pronounce it with a slight difference between a hard cough or a het. So, so the point of this is that phonetically these words are almost identical. And quite often you'll see that in the scripture, firstborn and chosen are used in parallel verses as like a type of poetic reference, so that you could almost interchange the chosen with the firstborn. And so Mr. Velikovsky's his theory is that it wasn't actually the firstborn that was chosen. It wasn't the firstborn that was killed necessarily. It was the chosen of Egypt that was killed. You're talking about the wealthy people, the elite, the people that have built up huge mansions by, selling Enoch calendars and coffee or something like that, like Joel Osteen did. Or the Pharaoh, we're talking about the elite of Egypt, the Barack Obamas and the Nancy Pelosi's, like their houses. Now notice it says here in this passage in Exodus 12:27, it says that he delivered our houses. Now you could say, well, the house is the family. Well, possibly, or could it be the literal house? Could the thing that was struck, Nagath, was struck by the angel of Yahuwah, was the house that was struck. So what kind of violent striking would hit a house and cause it to be destroyed? Well, an earthquake. An earthquake can be described as a violent shock that would destroy a house. Now let's look at the type of houses these two different people groups lived in. Well, the elite, the upper crust of society, they were living in brick and stone houses or palaces. Now, an earthquake hits a brick house made with mud bricks, like the ancient Israelites used to build houses with. There is no mechanism built into those houses to absorb that shock. Those houses would have been destroyed. However, the Israelites, the slaves, the poor people of Egypt, would have lived in mud huts. Now, a mud hut would probably survive the earthquake. And even if it didn't, if you had a mud hut collapse, chances are the people in the hut will probably make it out alive. Now, they may be injured, but they're probably going to survive that. You're probably not going to be killed by, a mud wall in your tiny little hut collapsing. And so let's keep that in mind as we go forward in this study. Okay, so the residence of the king and the palaces of the rich were tossed to the ground, and with them the houses of the common people and the dungeons of captives. Exodus 12:29, and it came to pass that at midnight Yahuwah smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat in his throne, unto the firstborn of the captive that was in the dungeon. Notice that there's this dungeon mentioned. The papyrus says, forsooth, the children of princes are dashed against the walls. Again, what I was saying earlier about, could this possibly be the 10th plague? So the children of princes are dashed against the walls, the children of princes are cast out in the streets, and the prison, or the dungeon, is ruined. It parallels directly with the book of Exodus. In the papyrus it is written, he who placed his brother in the ground is everywhere. It corresponds to Exodus 12:30. It says, there was not a house where there was not one dead. Exodus 12:30, it is written, there was a great cry in Egypt. It corresponds to the papyrus. It is groaning that is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations. The first omens of an approaching catastrophe brought unrest to the land, and the captives longed to escape for freedom. The papyrus narrates that men ventured to rebel against the uraeus, or the emblem of royal authority. So basically, I think it's saying that, the people are going around saying taxation is theft and making memes of Pharaoh Obama and posting those on the Egyptian Facebook, that kind of thing. So the people were questioning the authority. Magical spells connected with the serpent are divulged. Now this made me stop. I was like, wait a minute. Remember what Moses and Aaron did when they went in before Pharaoh, and Moses threw his staff on the ground and it turned into what? A serpent. Now, Ippur is saying that one of his lamentations is that somebody has divulged these secret spells. I almost wonder if this is a direct reference to Moses turning his staff into a serpent. Gold and jewels are fastened on the neck of female slaves. Compare that to Exodus 11:12, where it says, "Let every man borrow of his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, jewels of silver and jewels of gold." So even when the Israelites are going in and plundering the Egyptians and getting all their wealth, that's even reflected here, that the slaves now are walking around wearing all this jewelry and all these treasures. The collapse of stone structures, the dead and wounded in the debris, the fall of many statues of the gods inspired dread and horror. All of these looked upon in the papyrus as what? The acts of the god of the slaves. So Ippur himself is attributing all this disaster to the god of the slaves. The following lines speak of a population escaping a disaster. Men flee. Tents are what they make, like the dwellers of the hills. In the book of Exodus, it said that the Israelites left the country in haste, and that a mixed multitude went with them, and their first stop would have been a place called Sukkot, which of course means tents or tabernacles. So you see this connection where Ippur is talking about the people building tents, and Exodus is saying that the people went to this place called tents. The escaped slaves hurried across the border of the country. Exodus says, "By day a pillar of a cloud to lead them in the way, and by night a pillar of fire to give them light to go by day and night." The papyrus says, "Behold, the fire has mounted up on high. Its burning goes forth against the enemies of the land." So you even see this reference to the pillar of fire in the papyrus. After the first manifestations of the protracted cataclysm, the Egyptians tried to bring order to the land. They traced the route of the escaped slaves. The wanderers became entangled in the land. The wilderness shut them in. They turned to the sea. They stood at Pi-hahiroth. The Egyptians pursued after them. The Egyptians marched after them. A hurricane blew all the night, and the sea fled. In a great avalanche of water, the sea returned in its strength, and the Egyptians fled against it. The sea engulfed the chariots and the horsemen, the Pharaoh and all his host. The papyrus of Ippur records only that the Pharaoh was lost under unusual circumstances that, quote, "have never happened before," end quote. The Egyptian wrote his lamentations, and even in the broken lines they are perceptible. "Weep, the earth is, on every side, weep." Then invaders approached out of the gloom of the desert. They crossed the borders and entered into the shattered land. The papyrus says, "Forsooth, the desert is throughout the land. The nomes are laid waste. A foreign tribe from abroad has come to Egypt." The catastrophe that rendered Egypt defenseless was a signal to the tribes of the Arabian desert. What has happened? Through it is to cause the Asiatics to know the condition of the land. Men, they have come to an end for themselves. There are none found to stand and protect themselves. It was surprising to find in the papyrus, in addition to the story of dwellers in marshes and poor men who fled the land scourged by plagues, it also laments about invaders who came from the desert of Asia, preyed upon the disorganized country, and became its violent oppressors. Amu, or the Hyksos, were the invaders who ruled Egypt during the centuries that separated the period of the Middle Kingdom from that of the New Kingdom. Josephus, in his pamphlet Against Apion, preserves some of the second book of Manetho's History of Egypt. Manetho lived in the 1st century BC, I believe, and his works have been lost except for what is preserved by Josephus. Josephus says, I will quote Manetho's only words, just as if I had produced the man himself in the witness box. Timaeus, in his reign, I know not why, a blast of Elohim's displeasure broke upon us. A people of ignoble origin from the east, whose coming was unforeseen, had the audacity to invade the country, which they mastered by main force without difficulty or even a battle. Manetho, who wrote in Greek, explains their being named Hyksos. Their race bore the generic name of Hyksos, which means king shepherds. For Hyk in the sacred language denotes king, and Sos in the common dialect means shepherd or shepherds. The combined words form Hyksos, or king shepherds. As already noted in a previous page, the remnants of Egyptian literature, the Hyksos, are called Amu. So essentially, to the Greek world, they're remembered as Hyksos. To the Egyptian world, they're remembered as Amu. So the question is, how were they remembered in the Israelite or scriptural world? Could it be that they have another name, just as the Hyksos and Amu are two different names for the same group of people? So what do we know about the Hyksos? The Hyksos were a people imbued to the core with the spirit of destruction. As far as is known, no monuments of any historical or artistic value were erected under their rule. No literary works survived their domination in Egypt, with the exception of lamentations such as those contained in the Ipuwer Papyrus. The memory of the wickedness of these nomads is preserved by Manetho Josephus. The scriptures furnish no information about what happened in Egypt after the Israelites departed. So, reading this description of the Hyksos, does it sound like any group of people from the scripture? Who would this group of people from the scripture be that were imbued to the core with the spirit of destruction? Prostrated by the appalling blows of nature, the Egyptians did not defend themselves. It is not clear whether 1 million of people in the next sentence is the number of the perished or of the intruders. It says, today fear, more than 1 million of people, not seeing enemies, enter into the temples. To all the previous plagues, this was added. Pillagers completed the destruction, killing and raping. So who were the Hyksos? The invaders came from Asia. This is stated in the Ipuwer Papyrus. The Israelites went in the direction of Asia. The two continents, Asia and Africa, are separated by a small triangular piece of land. There was a good chance that the Israelites moving toward Asia would meet the Amu invaders moving toward the Egyptian frontier. So the question is, did they meet? Well, they actually did. Even before the Israelites reached Mount Sinai, they met multitudes of Amalek. At Meribah, which is at the foot of Horeb, where the people thirsted for water in the bed of a stony valley, came Amalek and fought with Israel in Rephidim. Moses, Aharon, and Hur went up to the top of the hill and prayed there while Joshua fought with Amalek. Now the rabbinic tradition says in this encounter, Joshua faced 400,000 Amalekite warriors. So if you're wondering about any of these, I'm going to reference several times rabbinic tradition or the Haggadah or something like that. Now Velikovsky makes extensive use of the literary work, The Legends of the Jews by Ginsburg. So if you have a copy of that book, you should be able to find a lot of this information in there. Or you can download a copy of the PDF for Ages and Chaos that actually gives you all the references to where this information can be found. Later in the southern approach to Canaan was close to the Israelites. The Amalekites, it said, dwelt in the land of the south. So according to the Midrash, southern Palestine had not originally been their home, but the Amalekites had just recently settled there. The people to whom this message was brought by the 12 men wept that night. Would Elohim that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would Elohim that we had died in this wilderness? To inspire this boundless fear, the Amalekites must have been not mere bands of Bedouin robbers, but a force superior to other peoples in the area. The above remark in the Midrash that southern Palestine was not originally the home of the Amalekites, and that they had only recently occupied that area, draws our attention. The Amalekites evidently had conquered the south of Palestine only a short time before, because the arrivals from Egypt were not aware of their presence in the region. So that would explain why it was such a surprise to the Israelites that the Amalekites were there, because they just recently got there. I mean, if you think about it, Palestine is not really all that far away from Egypt, so if the Amalekites dwelt in the land, you would think that the Egyptian slaves would at least be aware of that. In the course of their migration, the Amalekites apparently divided and turned simultaneously toward Egypt and toward the south of Palestine, or Israel. Because of the Amalekites, the Israelites were compelled to roam the desert for a whole generation. The Islamic historians considered Amalek as one of the most ancient of the Arab tribes. The Amalekites ruled in Mecca. I find that interesting. And from their central positions on the Great Peninsula dominated other Arabian tribes. All parts of Arabia Felix, Arabia Petraea, and Arabia Deserta were alike were within reach of their bows, and then came the upheaval. There was a flood, an immense wave. People were swept away by a blast. The earth quaked violently. The catastrophe was preceded by plagues. The tradition is thus handed down by Abul Faraji, who lived from 897 to 967 Common Era, in Kitab al-Ghani, or it's an Arabian book of songs. It says, the tradition reports that the Amalekites violated the privileges of the sacred territory, and that the Almighty Elohim sent against them ants of the smallest variety, which forced them to desert Mecca. Afterwards, Yeshua sent drought and famine and showed them the clouded sky at the horizon. So they were experiencing this drought, and they saw clouds on the horizon. So they marched without rest toward the clouds, which they saw near them, but were not able to reach them. They were pursued by the drought, which was always at their heels, and Yeshua led them to their native land, where he sent against them typhoon, or a deluge. So a lot of these natural phenomena that are being described by these Arabian historians also correspond with what we are now seeing was actually taking place in the Exodus. It was not a peaceful, clear skies kind of departure. There was turmoil going on. There was clouds of dust and storms raging and that sort of thing. And this didn't affect just Egypt. This affected the whole region. In fact, Velikovsky even brings out sources in his book Worlds in Collision that describes the event as worldwide. But like I said, that's outside the scope of this study. Masudi, who lived in the 9th century or 10th century, also relates to the tradition of this catastrophe and tells of swift clouds, ants, and other signs of Yahuwah's rage. When many perished in Mecca, a turbulent torrent overwhelmed the land of Dejonah, and the whole population drowned in a single night. The scene of the catastrophe is known by the name of Edom, or Fury. Omiyah, son of Abu Salt of the tribe of Taqif, alluded to this event in a verse worded thus: in days of yore, the Dejorhomites settled in Tahama, and a violent flood carried all of them away. The Amalekites were put to flight by plagues that fell upon them in Arabia, and in their escape they followed the swift clouds. Meanwhile, Mecca was destroyed in a single night, filled with a terrible din. The land became a desert. Masudi says, from El Hajon up to Safa became all desert. In Mecca, the nights are silent, no voice of pleasant talk. We dwelt there, but in a most tumultuous night, in the most terrible of devastations, we were destroyed. So in tumult and disorder, fleeing the ominous signs and plagues, and driving their herds of animals, infuriated by earthquakes and evil portents, the fugitive bands of Amalekites reached the shores of the Red Sea. Plagues of insects, drought, earthquakes in the night, the most terrible devastation, clouds sweeping the ground, a tidal flood carrying away entire tribes. These disturbances and upheavals were experienced in Arabia and Egypt alike. This succession of phenomena helps us to recognize that they occurred at the time of the Israelites' escape from Egypt, also visited by plagues. The Israelites met the Amalekites for the first time a few days after they had crossed the sea. Now, many ancient Arab writers record the invasion of Egypt by the Amalekites, and there are numerous statements about the Amalekite pharaohs. One Arab author admitted that there was no concurrence as to the race of the pharaoh who reigned at the time of Moses, whether he was a Copt, a Syrian, or an Amalekite. There it was told that Syria and Egypt became simultaneously under the domination of the Amalekites, who escaped from Arabia when it was visited by a plague of insects, drought and famine, and an earthquake, and a flood at Safa and Tahama. An important historical moment is revealed in the sequence. A natural catastrophe composed of many significant phenomena was the cause of a hurried migration of Amalekites towards Syria and Egypt. After the Amalekites invaded Syria and Egypt, they established a dynasty of their pharaohs. Al-Samhudi, who lived in the 9th and 10th centuries, wrote, "The Amalekites reached Syria and Egypt and took possession of these lands, and the tyrants of Syria and the pharaohs of Egypt were of their origin." So again, you see this reference to Amalekite pharaohs. Masudi, who wrote about the plagues that befell Arabia and the flight to the Amalekites from Mecca and the flood, recounted also the conquest of Egypt by the Amalekites. An Amalekite king, El-Walid, son of Duma, arrived from Syria, invaded Egypt and conquered it, seized the throne, and occupied it without opposition his life long. In another work of his, Masudi gives a more detailed account of the conquest of El-Walid. He says, El-Walid, son of Duma, advanced at the head of a numerous army with the intention to overrun diverse countries and to overthrow their sovereigns. The end of this passage recalls the sentence of the Haggadah, where it says that Amalek, in his wantonness, undertook to destroy the whole world. Masudi continues, "When this conqueror came to Syria, he heard rumors about Egypt. He sent there one of his servants named Una with a great host of warriors. El-Walid oppressed the inhabitants, seized their possessions, and drew forth all the treasures he could find. The Amalekites entered Egypt, destroyed many monuments, and objects of art. The Amalekites invaded Egypt, the frontier of which they had already crossed, and started to ravage the country, to smash objects of art, to ruin the monuments." Abu Feda, who lived in the 13th century, in his History of Pre-Islamic Arabia wrote, "There were Egyptian pharaohs of Amalekite descent." So numerous historians are in agreement on this. Numerous Arabic historians. Now, when it comes to the mainstream, or to the Western historians, it says that the historical background of these stories about the Amalekite pharaohs in Egypt was regarded with distrust. There were scholars who took an even more radical viewpoint and asserted that the Amalekites had never existed. They based their conclusion on the assumption that the name of the Amalekite tribe was never mentioned in Egyptian inscriptions. On the other hand, an equally extreme viewpoint doubted the very fact of the invasion of Egypt by the Hyksos, and interpreted it as a story of legendary origin. The Hyksos were supposed to be just another dynasty of native rulers. So you can see that these historians are both disregarding or doubting the existence of either group, because the sources, they think they're describing two different groups of people, but no one seems to realize that the Hyksos and the Amalekites are actually the same group. An old Hebrew legend gives an additional connection to the Hyksos. It says that Amalek fetched from Egypt the table of the descent of the Israelites. These lists lay in the Egyptian archives. Amalek appeared before the Israelite camp, and calling the people by name, he invited them to leave the camp and come out to him. The legend implies knowledge on the part of the Israelites of the fact that the Amalekites came to Egypt and became the rulers of the land. In what other way could they have come into possession of the census lists in the Egyptian archives? And the Papyrus Ipuwer said, "Forsooth, the public offices are opened, and the census lists are taken away. Serfs become the lord of serfs." So when the Amalekites vanquished Egypt, they may have looked on themselves as the legatees of the former Egyptian empire with its colonies. And in their wars with the Israelites in succeeding centuries, they may have argued that the Israelites had deserted their bondage in Egypt. So basically, they were probably claiming that now they were the rightful owners of these slaves that had fled from Egypt. The problem of why in the books of Joshua and Judges, which cover more than 400 years, there's no mention of Egyptian domination over Canaan or any allusion to military expeditions headed by pharaohs has remained unsolved. Yet during this long period of time, according to the conventional chronology, Palestine was dominated by Egypt. So if Israel had left Egypt in the middle of the new kingdom, well, we should see that in the book of Judges and Joshua, because during that time, Egypt was at the height of their power. So how is it that Egypt's not even mentioned in the book of Judges? The revision presented here places the time of the wandering of Joshua and of Judges in the period of the Hyksos Amalekite rule over Egypt. In harmony with this revised scheme, the Amalekites must have been regarded at that time as the mightiest among the nations. Now Balaam the sorcerer was called upon to curse the Israelites approaching Moab on their way from the desert. He set his face toward the wilderness, but instead of cursing, he blessed Israel with these words. Numbers 24, his seed shall be as many waters, and his long shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. Agag was the name of the Amalekite king. Standing on the edge of the mountain, Balaam turned his face in another direction. And when he looked on Amalek, he took up his parable and said, Amalek is the first among the nations, but his latter end shall be that he perish forever. These verses do not seem clear. The Amalekites are supposed to have been an unimportant band of robbers. Why were they called the first among the nations? And what could the blessing higher than Agag mean? No satisfactory explanation has been presented. The Amalekites were at that time the first among the nations. The highest degree of power was expressed in comparison with the power of the Amalekite king Agag. He was the ruler over Arabia and Egypt. The name of the king Agag is the only Amalekite name that the scriptures have preserved. Besides the king Agag mentioned in the book of Numbers, there was another Amalekite king, Agag, the last king, who ruled some 400 years later and was a contemporary of King Saul. In the history of Egypt, the most frequently mentioned name of the Hyksos king is Apop. One of the first and most prominent of the Hyksos rulers was Apop. The last king of the Hyksos was also named Apop. Almost every hieroglyphic consonant in Egyptian hieroglyphics stands for more than one sound, and only empirically are the sounds symbolized by a consonant sound. Agag the first appears to be Apop the first, and Agag the second, Apop the second. King Agag ruled at the beginning of the period, according to Manetho. Apop was the fourth king of the Hyksos dynasty and ruled for 61 years. Agag the second ruled at the very end of the period, some 400 years later. So this lines up perfectly with what we see in Scripture. So according to Manetho, as quoted by Josephus, the Hyksos period lasted 511 years. So that begs the question, what caused the Hyksos rule to end? There's a tablet in Egypt known as the Carnarvon tablet, which records the participation of the vassal pharaoh Kahamos, son of Sekneri, in action against the Hyksos. So this native Egyptian pharaoh went out and waged a war against the Hyksos. It says that he was assisted by some foreign troops. An Egyptian monument has also been preserved, or has also preserved a description of the final act. The story of the expulsion of the Hyksos is engraved on the wall of the tomb of an officer of Ahamos, a vassal pharaoh of one of the nomes, and probably the brother of Kahamos. The name of the officer was also Ahamos. Not rebellious Egyptian princes, but some warriors coming from abroad were the real deliverers of Egypt. The inscription reads, I followed on the king on foot when he rode abroad in his chariot. One besieged the city of Avarice. I showed valor on foot before his majesty. One fought on the river in the canal. or the riverbed of Avaris. Then there was again fighting in this place. I again fought. One fought in this Egypt, south of this city. Then I brought away a living captive. One captured Avaris. One besieged Shaharun for 6 years, and his majesty took it. So I just want to point out something in this inscription. This person that's referred to just as one is mentioned as fighting in the water of the riverbed or canal. And also there's a mention of a living captive being taken from this city. The indefinite pronoun would not have been used if the Egyptian king had been at the head of the besieging army. Had the Egyptian prince been the main figure in this war for freedom, his triumph would not have been attributed to the indefinite one. Egyptian inscriptions did not memorialize the deeds of foreign kings, and hence the name of the king who destroyed the Hyksos is missing. 1 Samuel 15, 2-3. Thus says Yeshua of hosts, I remember that Amalek, what he did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. So Saul gathered 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. And in 1 Samuel 15:5 it says Saul came to the city of Amalek and laid wait in the bed of the river or the stream. So you see this connection now. It was King Saul, and he was the one who was laying wait in the bed of the river. Verses 7-8 says, Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until thou comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took King Agag of the Amalekites alive. So the identity of the foreign liberator of Egypt is revealed in the scriptures. The one was King Saul. Apop was Agag II. The Amalekite city was Avaris. In Egyptian and Hebrew sources alike, the strategic use of the bed of the stream in the siege of the city is stressed. So after the capture of the Amalekite city and Saul's overwhelming victory, the Amalekites were not wholly destroyed. Those who escaped with their lives fell back to the hill country of southern Palestine. From there they undertook a raid on the neighboring cities. This was still during the reign of Saul, and David was one of his officers. So the Amalekites, according to 1 Samuel 30, it says the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag and smitten Ziklag and burned it with fire and went on their way. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captive. The practice of burning the cities and carrying off the women and children and withdrawing was the same as the Hyksos had employed in Egypt when they invaded it 400 or 500 years before. Manetho says they savagely burned the cities, carrying off the wives and children into slavery. The exact same thing you see them trying to do with David's wives. It says, and they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. And when he had eaten, his spirit came again to him. And David said unto him, to whom belongeth thou? And he said, I'm a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me because 3 days ago I fell sick. So David followed the Egyptian slave, found the Amalekite band, and rescued the captive women and children. The episode is most instructive. It shows that the Amalekites invaded the south of Palestine after they had lost their stronghold on the border of Egypt. It reveals also a very striking detail. The Egyptian young man said that he was a slave to an Amalekite master. This man, in identifying himself, spoke of his being a servant and the Amalekite being the master, as of something that was the order of the day. Of course, but the times were changing. So this event, this battle of Saul overthrowing the Amalekite city, it even details that he took a prisoner captive, which would have been Agag. And of course, this led to the downfall of Saul, but it also led to the end of the Hyksos rule. And it was all thanks to a king of Israel, removing them from their position of power. Now, why is this important? Well, Velikovsky in his book, he goes on to not just talk about the Hyksos, but he goes into the kings and the pharaohs that followed this period. So and prove that there's a connection, because if there's a connection between Saul and the end of the Hyksos, well, there should be a connection between David and the pharaohs that reigned during his time, and Solomon and the pharaohs that reigned during his time. For instance, during the days of Solomon, there is this visit mentioned of the Queen of Sheba who visited Solomon, and of course it's a very famous event. Well, Velikovsky, in my opinion, proves that the Queen of Sheba is actually Queen Hatshepsut, who reigned during the same time as Solomon did, if this alternate timeline is true. And not only that, but the visit of Queen Hatshepsut to the land of Israel is recorded and depicted on the walls of her temple, called the Most Splendid of Splendors, at Deir el-Bahari in Thebes in Egypt. And you can actually see on the walls of this temple her visit to Solomon. You can see her bringing back these plants and animals and stuff, the gifts that she gave to that Solomon gave to her. And it speaks about her bringing gifts to him. It's all depicted right there. Also, in the days of Rehoboam, Scripture says that Shishak, king of Egypt, invaded Israel and took the treasures of the temple of Solomon. Well, Shishak is Thutmose III, who would have been the son of Queen Hatshepsut. So is it possible that, there's rumors that there was a romantic type of relationship between Solomon and Hatshepsut. So could it be that Thutmose III was angry at Solomon because of this affair that he had with his mother, and so then as soon as his mother dies, he's going off to wage war against Israel? It could be a possibility. But he captured the treasure of the temple, and he brought that back to Egypt. Well, this treasure, this booty that he brought back from Israel, is actually pictured on the walls of the temple of Thutmose III. He's got a temple in Karnak, and it's the altar of incense, the shields, those golden shields that Scripture mentions that David made, the plates and the utensils, and the pillars that were in front of the Temple of Solomon. All of that stuff is depicted on the walls of Thutmose III's temple as he's bringing these spoils back from this land that he refers to as God's land. And all of this is there in stone, so to speak, in Egypt. So anyway, that's my message for today. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the best, and I hope this has been a blessing to you. Shalom.